Picture this for a moment. It's the day before Thanksgiving, November 24th, 1971. The world feels very different. Air travel isn't weighed down with the security checks we have today. People breeze through airports with hardly a second thought. Smoking on planes is allowed, the seats are bigger, the atmosphere is casual. It's the golden age of air travel, or at least the romantic version of it. Now in Portland, Oregon, the airport is buzzing with families trying to get home for the holidays. Kids are clutching toys, businessmen are checking their watches, and airline staff are juggling the chaos that always comes with the holidays. Among the crowd, there's a man who doesn't stand out. He doesn't look suspicious. He doesn't seem nervous. He looks, in fact, like 100 other men you'd see passing through an airport. He's dressed neatly, wearing a dark business suit, a white shirt, and a black tie held in place with a pearl tie pin. In his hand is a small black briefcase. He's somewhere in his mid-40s, maybe early 50s. To anyone who saw him, he would look like another traveling salesman, another commuter hopping a short flight for work. At the counter, he buys a one-way ticket to Seattle. He pays cash, $20, which even then wasn't much. And the name he uses is simple, Dan Cooper. There's no identification required, no questions asked. He pockets his ticket, boards the plane, and finds his seat, 18C, toward the back. It's Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short half-hour trip from Portland to Seattle. Just another routine flight. But this flight was never going to be routine, because that man, Dan Cooper, was about to vanish into history as one of the most mysterious and legendary criminals America has ever known. We know him today as D.B. Cooper, a name that was never his real alias at all, but a mistake made by the press that stuck. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't violent, but what he was about to do would shake the FBI, rewrite air travel forever, and create a legend that still hasn't died more than 50 years later. As the plane takes off, nothing seems unusual. Cooper takes a cigarette from his pack and lights up. Completely normal at the time. He orders a bourbon and soda, pays in cash, and sits calmly, sipping his drink, smoke curling around him. He's quiet, collected, polite. The other passengers don't notice anything strange. But not long after takeoff, he makes his first move. He slips a folded note into the hand of flight attendant Florence Schaffner. At first, she doesn't even look at it. She assumes it's a phone number from a lonely businessman, which was common enough in those days. She tucks it into her pocket without reading it. But Cooper leans toward her, his voice low, steady, calm. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Imagine being in her position. 1 second you're dealing with drink orders and seat belts, and the next a passenger is telling you he has a bomb on board. When Florence opens the note, she finds a neatly written message explaining his demands. He tells her to sit beside him, and when she does, he opens his briefcase just slightly. Inside she sees wires, red sticks, and a battery. Whether it was real or fake has never been confirmed, but to her it looked real enough to freeze her blood. He explains what he wants. He's not shouting. He's not waving the supposed bomb around. He's calm, like he's ordering lunch. He tells her he wants $200,000 in cash. He wants 4 parachutes. And when the plane lands in Seattle, he wants a fuel truck waiting so the plane can take off again without delay. He is precise. He knows what he wants and he delivers it with the composure of a man who has thought this through many times before. She carries the message to the cockpit. The captain, William Scott, listens in disbelief, then radios air traffic control. Within minutes, the FBI is notified. And just like that, a short flight from Portland to Seattle turns into one of the most famous hijackings in history. Now think about those demands again. $200,000 in cash, That's about $1.3 million in today's money. It's a fortune, but it's not insane. It's not the kind of sum that would be impossible to pull together on short notice. And the parachutes. Why 4 of them? Later, investigators would theorize that this was a clever trick. If he asked for just 1 parachute, authorities might sabotage it. But by asking for 4, it implied he might take hostages with him. He knew they wouldn't dare tamper with the equipment. Whoever this man was, he wasn't reckless. He was calculating. As the plane circles over Seattle, waiting for preparations to be made, the atmosphere inside remains strangely calm. Cooper isn't terrorizing the passengers. He's not aggressive. He even makes small talk with the crew. At one point, he orders another bourbon and soda. He drinks. He smokes. He seems almost relaxed, as though this isn't a hijacking at all, but some kind of routine business transaction. The passengers in the cabin are oblivious to what's going on. They think they're delayed because of weather or some minor issue. Some are annoyed, but none suspect that they're part of a crime that will live on in infamy. On the ground, the FBI scrambles. They rush to gather $200,000 in old $20 bills. They make sure each bill is recorded so if the money ever turns up, they'll know it's from this crime. They gather parachutes from a local skydiving school and from an Air Force base. By the time the plane lands in Seattle around 5:45 in the evening, everything Cooper asked for is waiting. The exchange is carried out smoothly. Cooper releases the passengers without incident. One by one, 36 people walk off that plane, confused but unharmed. Some don't even realize what has been happening until later. Inside, only the crew remain. Pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, and a couple of flight attendants. Cooper takes the cash. He inspects the parachutes with the eye of someone who seems to know what he's looking at. Then he lays out his next instructions. The plane, he says, is going to fly to Mexico City. But not just any flight plan will do. He's very specific. The plane must fly at 10,000 feet, low enough to avoid pressurization. It must not go faster than 200 miles per hour. It must fly with the landing gear down. These aren't the requests of a casual hijacker. These are the instructions of a man who understands how the Boeing 727 works, who knows its limits and what it can do. The pilots are stunned by his knowledge, but they comply. At 7:40 p.m., the plane takes off again, this time into the stormy night skies over Washington. It's raining, it's windy, conditions are far from ideal, but Cooper is ready. Somewhere over southwestern Washington, not long after 8 o'clock, he makes his move. He puts on one of the parachutes. He ties the bag of money, 21 pounds in total, securely to himself. Then he lowers the rear stairway of the plane, something unique to the Boeing 727, and at approximately 8:13 p.m., in the dark of night, in the middle of a storm, he jumps. Think about the audacity of that. No modern GPS, no night vision, just a man leaping into freezing rain in pitch black over dense forests and rugged terrain with nothing but a parachute and a bag of money. The crew in the cockpit notice a sudden bump in cabin pressure. They know something has happened, but by the time they land the plane in Reno hours later, Cooper is gone. The parachute is gone, the money is gone, and the man known only as Dan Cooper has vanished into legend. The FBI reacts immediately. Within hours, one of the greatest manhunts in American history is underway. Hundreds of searchers comb the forests, rivers, and mountains of Washington and Oregon. Helicopters sweep the skies. Ground teams move through thick wilderness. Paratroopers drop in. But there's nothing. No trace of a parachute. No sign of a body. No shred of evidence. It's as if he evaporated into thin air. Weeks pass, then months, then years. Still nothing. Cooper has pulled off something no one thought possible. He has disappeared. The only clue that ever surfaces comes nearly a decade later, in 1980, when a young boy camping with his family on the banks of the Columbia River finds decaying $20 bills buried in the sand. The serial numbers match the ransom money. But the find raises more questions than answers. Why were only some of the bills there? Where was the rest of the money? Had Cooper buried it himself, or had the river carried it downstream? Did he die in the jump scattering the money? Or did he survive and stash it away somewhere? No one knows. And that's what makes the story so powerful. Because the mystery of D.B. Cooper isn't just about a hijacking. It's about what came after. The investigation, the suspects, the endless theories, and the enduring fascination with a man who may have pulled off the perfect crime.
In the next chapter, we'll step into the shoes of the FBI and see how the greatest law enforcement agency in the United States tried to solve the unsolvable, and why, even with all their resources, they came up empty-handed. When the Boeing 727 touched down in Reno that night, hours after Cooper had vanished into the storm, the crew opened the doors to find FBI agents already waiting. The pilots and flight attendants were exhausted, shaken, but unharmed. The money was gone. The parachutes were gone. And of course, the mysterious man in the black suit was gone too. The first thing the FBI wanted to know was simple. Where did he jump? But the answer wasn't simple at all. The crew knew only that they had felt a sudden change in air pressure around 8:13 p.m., which meant Cooper had opened the rear stairs. They assumed he had jumped it then, but pinpointing the exact location was nearly impossible. The plane had been flying low, in bad weather, at night, over some of the most rugged and unforgiving terrain in the Pacific Northwest. The potential landing zone stretched for miles. Dense forest, rivers, rocky hillsides, and farmland. Still, the FBI launch became one of the most intense manhunts in American history. Over the following weeks, hundreds of people scoured the suspected drop zone. Paratroopers jumped into the woods. Helicopters hovered overhead. Police, state troopers, even volunteers combed through the underbrush looking for any sign of a parachute, a broken tree limb, a body, anything. But the forest kept its secrets. Not a single trace of Cooper was found. It was as if the man had jumped into a void and disappeared. The search continued through the winter and into the spring. And yet, with every day that passed without evidence, the myth of D.B. Cooper grew stronger. To the FBI, it was an embarrassment. To the public, it was a mystery unlike any other. Now, here's the thing about the FBI at that time. They were no strangers to hijackings. In fact, the late 1960s and early 1970s were filled with them. Hijackings were so common that some people joked airliners were like sky taxis for desperate criminals. Most of those cases ended with the hijacker captured or killed. But D.B. Cooper's crime was different. It was neat. It was calculated. And it ended with the hijacker vanishing into thin air. The Bureau had never seen anything like it. So they started from scratch. They gathered everything they could from the plane. Cooper had left behind his black tie, his tie pin, and 2 of the parachutes he hadn't used. He had smoked several cigarettes, he had ordered drinks, he had handled the briefcase. But remember, this was 1971. DNA analysis didn't exist yet. Forensic science was limited. All the FBI could do was lift fingerprints and look for fibers. They found some partial prints, but none matched anyone in their system. They interviewed the crew extensively. Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant who had spoken most with Cooper, described him as calm, polite, and intelligent. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't drunk, he was controlled. The other flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, said much the same. He had been courteous, even considerate. At one point, he offered her a cigarette. He made sure the crew had time to eat. He wasn't a man in panic. He was a man in control of his situation. And then there was the sketch. Working with witnesses, the FBI produced a composite drawing. A middle-aged man, brown eyes, neatly combed dark hair, thin lips, a business suit. Ordinary. So ordinary, in fact, that the sketch looked like half the men in America at the time. He could have been a banker, a salesman, a teacher, your neighbor down the street. There was nothing exotic or striking about him. He was the perfect face for a mystery criminal, invisible in plain sight. The FBI began checking flight schools, parachute clubs, military records. They cross-referenced missing persons reports, they interviewed hundreds of people, and yet every lead fizzled out. Then came the first twist in the story. Remember, he had used the name Dan Cooper when he bought the ticket. Somehow, a reporter got the wrong name, mixing it up with another man named D.B. Cooper who lived in Oregon and had nothing to do with the crime. The media ran with it, and soon the hijacker was being called D.B. Cooper. And that mistake stuck. Even today, half a century later, we still know him as D.B., not Dan. As months turned into years, the FBI collected suspects. Dozens of men were investigated, and a few stood out more than others. One of the earliest was a man named Dwayne Weber, who supposedly confessed to being D.B. Cooper on his deathbed. Another was Richard McCoy, a former Army veteran who staged a copycat hijacking in 1972, parachuting out of a plane with nearly $500,000. McCoy was caught and sent to prison, but he escaped and was killed in a shootout with the FBI. Some agents believe McCoy had also been Cooper, though others dismissed the idea, pointing out major differences in appearance and execution. Then there was Kenneth Christensen, a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient flight attendant. He matched the general description, and some circumstantial evidence pointed in his direction, but again, no proof. Another favorite suspect was a man named William Gossett, a World War II veteran and survivalist who supposedly told friends he was Cooper, and the list goes on. Military men, ex-cons, pilots, outdoorsmen, each with some tantalizing connection, but never enough to close the case. The truth was, the FBI didn't even know if Cooper had survived the jump, and that question haunted the investigation. Because when you really think about it, the odds were against him. He jumped at night, in a storm, into a wilderness of rivers and cliffs and trees. He wore a business suit, not survival gear. The money was bulky, strapped to him awkwardly. If he missed his landing, he could have drowned in the river. He could have hit the ground too hard. He could have been lost forever in the wilderness. But then again, what if he had made it? What if he was exactly what he appeared to be? A skilled jumper, someone who knew planes, someone who knew the terrain, and someone who had prepared for this for months. If that was the case, he could have walked away from the forest that night, free, alive, with a fortune in cash. And if he did, where did he go? Did he live quietly, never spending the ransom? Did he change his name, settle in some small town, and tell no one? Or did he brag about it in secret, dropping hints that only his closest friends could ever pick up? The FBI leaned heavily toward the idea that he hadn't survived. To them, the jump was suicidal. But the lack of a body, the lack of evidence, made that conclusion shaky. And then, years later, in 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was camping with his family near the Columbia River when he dug up several packets of old, decaying $20 bills. They were waterlogged, rotting, but still recognizable. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to Cooper. The bundles added up to about $6,000, only a fraction of the full ransom. That discovery reignited the case. How did the money get there? The FBI searched the area hoping to find more, but nothing else turned up. Some experts suggested the bills had washed downstream. Others thought Cooper himself might have buried them. But the find only deepened the mystery. If Cooper had died in the jump, why wasn't his body or the rest of the money ever found? If he had lived, why would he bury part of the ransom? It didn't add up. Meanwhile, the public fascination grew. Books were written, documentaries were made. Amateur sleuths obsessed over the case, combing through old FBI files, hiking through forests, comparing suspects' faces to the sketch. Everyone wanted to be the one to solve the puzzle. But for the FBI, the case became something else entirely. It became a stain. Despite years of work, they were no closer to the truth than they had been the night of the hijacking. Leads dried up, suspects aged and died, and still no one could say for sure who D.B. Cooper was or what happened to him after he leapt into that stormy night. By the time the case officially wound down decades later, it had become the longest-running unsolved hijacking in American history. But it was never just about the crime. It was about the myth. Because somewhere in those forests of Washington, or somewhere in the quiet suburbs of America, or perhaps long buried beneath the earth, lay the answer to the question that still echoes. Did D.B. Cooper make it? And as the Bureau closed in on their main suspects and theories, something else began to happen. The legend of D.B. Cooper left the world of criminal files and entered the world of pop culture. Songs were written about him, movies referenced him. He became a folk hero to some, a symbol of rebellion, a man who beat the system and disappeared. But before we get to the cultural side of the story, we need to look closer at those suspects, at the theories, and at how each one paints a different picture of who D.B. Cooper might have been. Because if there's one thing this mystery proves, it's that sometimes the legend is as powerful as the truth.
When we talk about the fate of Michael Rockefeller, the story naturally bends toward theories, because, at its core, this is a mystery without a confirmed ending. And with mysteries like this, human imagination tends to fill the gaps with both reason and folklore. The first theory, the one that seems most practical, is also the most tragic. It's the idea that Michael drowned, swallowed by the unpredictable currents of the Arafura Sea. His canoe had overturned, he had already swum for miles, and exhaustion could have easily pulled him beneath the surface. The waters in that region are not forgiving. They're vast, with strong undertows, and at times, dangerous wildlife lurking just beneath the waves. Crocodiles, sharks, and the endless drag of the tide could easily explain why no trace of him was ever found. For many officials, especially those who wanted closure, this was the safest explanation. It allowed them to mark the case as finished, to declare Michael a victim of nature rather than man. But then comes the second, darker theory, the one that has fascinated the world for decades, that Michael did not drown, but instead made it to shore, and that was when his real danger began. The southwestern coast of New Guinea at the time was home to the Asmat people, a tribe that the outside world often misunderstood. To many Western eyes, they were seen as fearsome, famed for their traditions of headhunting, ritual warfare, and even cannibalism. Of course, these customs were deeply tied to culture and spirituality, not simply acts of violence. But for a young foreigner washed up on their land, it could mean doom. Rumors spread quickly after Michael's disappearance. Whispers that he had been captured, that he was killed in accordance with ritual practices, or even that he was eaten, traveled across continents like wildfire. For some, this explanation felt both horrifying and inevitable. In the decades since, explorers, journalists, and adventurers have returned to the region to investigate, each hoping to uncover some truth. Several accounts claim that stories circulated among the Asmat themselves, that a white man had indeed come ashore, that he had been taken by villagers, and that he had been dealt with according to long-held customs. Some investigators even produced secondhand confessions, with villagers allegedly recalling a moment when strangers approached carrying Michael's body. These accounts, while chilling, were always shrouded in layers of translation, interpretation, and the biases of those telling them. Were they genuine testimonies, or stories told to satisfy outsiders who were desperate for answers? No one can say for sure. And then there's another theory, one that's less sinister, but equally captivating. What if Michael didn't die at all? What if, instead of drowning or being killed, he was taken in by the tribe? Some suggest that he could have lived among them, choosing or being forced to abandon his old life and adapt to a completely different existence. The Asmat were known for their isolation from the outside world, and it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where a lone survivor became part of their community. This idea has fueled countless speculations, books, and documentaries. People wonder if Michael could have lived for years as a hidden figure, blending into a culture so far removed from his own that his family and the world would never have found him. For many, this theory is romantic in a strange way, suggesting not just survival, but transformation. Of course, theories are only as strong as the evidence that supports them,
And in this case, the evidence is fragile at best. The Dutch authorities, who were overseeing the region at the time, conducted an investigation, but what they discovered was thin and inconclusive. Some claimed they had hints of foul play, while others insisted there was nothing to prove Michael had made it ashore. Decades later, journalists like Carl Hoffman revisited the story, uncovering reports and testimonies that suggested the Dutch government might have covered up details. Why would they do this? Possibly to avoid scandal, possibly to prevent tensions with the Asmat tribes, or simply because it was easier to close the case than to open old wounds. These possibilities only add to the shadow that hangs over the Rockefeller disappearance, creating an atmosphere where truth feels just out of reach. What makes this mystery even more powerful is how it blends with cultural fascination. The Rockefellers were not just any family, they were symbols of wealth, power, and influence. The disappearance of one of their own in such an exotic and perilous context struck a chord with the public imagination. Newspapers across the world ran with the story, often sensationalizing it with lurid headlines about cannibalism and tribal violence. Hollywood couldn't have written a script more perfectly designed to capture the world's attention. A wealthy young heir lost in the wilderness, surrounded by tribes that outsiders viewed with both fear and fascination. It was a story that blurred the lines between anthropology, adventure, and horror, and it remains one of the reasons people still talk about it today. But beyond the sensationalism lies something deeper, something more human. Michael wasn't just a Rockefeller. He was a young man with dreams, curiosity, and a desire to connect with people vastly different from himself. He had been studying art, fascinated by the cultural richness of the Asmat. He wanted to collect, to preserve, and to share their creations with the wider world. In a sense, his journey was driven not by privilege alone, but by genuine interest and respect. And that's what makes the theories about his end so haunting. If he was indeed killed by the very people he admired, it becomes a tragic tale of cultural misunderstanding. If he drowned, it becomes a cruel twist of fate. If he lived among them, it becomes a story of transformation that no one outside ever got to witness. This is why the mystery endures, not just because it is unsolved, but because it asks us to confront the tension between cultures, the dangers of exploration, and the limits of human endurance. Every theory, whether rational or outrageous, says something about us, about the way we try to make sense of the unknown. Some people lean toward logic, clinging to the drowning explanation. Others embrace the darkness, convinced of a violent end. And still others prefer the romantic notion of survival, imagining Michael alive, somewhere out there, even if only for a short while. And perhaps that's the greatest power of the Michael Rockefeller story. It refuses to be pinned down. It is both a cautionary tale and a legend. It's about a man, but it's also about the human need to explain, to fill in the blanks, to tell stories that stretch far beyond the facts. In the jungles of New Guinea, the truth might still be hidden. In the minds of those who hear it, the mystery continues to grow. Even after so many decades, the mystery of Michael Rockefeller continues to echo across generations, not just as an unresolved disappearance, but as a story that has become almost mythical. For some, it is a haunting reminder of how fragile human life is when faced with the unknown. For others, it represents the eternal curiosity and sometimes arrogance of human beings when we step into worlds that are not our own. It's strange how time has only deepened the fascination. In museums, books, and documentaries, his story is retold again and again, each version adding a little more speculation, a little more imagination, and a lot more emotion. And yet, at the heart of it, there remains a simple and painful truth. A young man set out on an adventure filled with dreams and ambition and never came back. The Rockefeller family, even with all their power, wealth, and influence, had to accept the one thing no family wants to hear: uncertainty. That, perhaps, is what gives this story such lasting resonance. Most disappearances eventually have an ending, whether tragic or not. But Michael's story? It sits in that unsettling space between fact and legend, The official record says he drowned, but the whispers, the testimonies, the local accounts, they tell another story. And in that tension between official silence and local memory, the myth was born. It's a myth that still breathes today, passed down like folklore. It's as though the jungle itself has claimed him, making him part of its eternal mystery. What makes his disappearance especially powerful is how it forces us to look inward. We ask ourselves, why does this story fascinate us so much? Is it because of who he was? The heir of one of the richest families in the world, someone who could have lived a comfortable life but instead chose to dive into the unknown? Or is it because his fate collides with something far more ancient and untamed than most of us will ever encounter? The Ozmat people, their rituals, their history, their way of life, they were not simply a backdrop to Michael's story, they were the beating heart of it. And his vanishing brings up uncomfortable questions about culture, respect, and what happens when worlds collide. It asks us to think about how we remember stories that don't neatly belong to just one side. Over time, the fascination with Michael's story has also become a mirror of our own changing views. In the 1960s, when the news broke, much of the world saw it only through the lens of tragedy and exoticism. Today, though, people also look at it with a deeper awareness of cultural respect and the mistakes of colonial attitudes. We're more careful in how we talk about tribes, about indigenous practices, about what happens when outsiders enter. In that sense, Michael's story has become more than just a disappearance. It has become a reflection of how societies learn, how history is remembered, and how myths are shaped by the times in which they are told. And yet, despite all the analysis and all the shifting perspectives, the emotional core remains heartbreakingly simple. A young man of just 23, with a whole future ahead of him, vanished in a corner of the world that was as mysterious as it was beautiful. The pain of that loss lingers, not just with his family, but with anyone who has ever followed the story. Because deep down, we all understand what it means to lose someone without answers. We all know that feeling of wanting closure, of wanting the truth, and never being able to touch it. That is why this story endures. Not because of the theories, not because of the myths, but because of the human ache it leaves behind. Even today, travelers and researchers who visit Papua hear his name. Locals still share whispers, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly, about the white man who disappeared. Some say he was taken by the sea. Others insist he walked into the forest and became part of it. And some even suggest that he might have been absorbed into the very culture he sought to understand, living on in memory, if not in body. That's the power of legends. They blur the line between fact and imagination, and Michael Rockefeller has, in many ways, become less of a person and more of a symbol of mystery, of curiosity, of the eternal tension between humanity and the unknown. As the decades pass, new generations will discover his story and ask the same questions we're asking today. They will feel the same chill, the same wonder, the same quiet sadness. And maybe that's the true legacy of Michael Rockefeller. Not just the art he collected, not just the photographs and journals he left behind, but the way his story forces us to confront the fragility of our place in the world. It's a reminder that no matter how powerful or privileged we are, nature still holds its secrets, and some stories will forever remain untold. And so, as we close this journey, we're left with more questions than answers, just as it has always been. Amelia Earhart's story is not just a tale of a missing plane, it's the story of a woman who dared to chase the horizon, who pushed past the limits of her time, and who became a symbol far greater than the mystery of her disappearance. The ocean may still guard its secrets, but her spirit has never been lost. It lives on in every young dreamer who looks to the sky, in every explorer who dares to take the next step, and in every believer who knows that some mysteries are meant not to be solved,
but to inspire. Amelia's flight continues, not across the globe, but across generations. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest legacy of all.